Hi, everybody. It's John Kraska, EveryLibrary, the EveryLibrary Institute. Today on EveryLibrary Live, we're talking, we're starting a series of conversations with the authors of some of the fantastic articles that came out of the special issue of the Political Librarian, our journal, our academic journal that looks at public policy, tax policy, education policy, and the intersection points of libraries. I'm very thrilled to be here with Allison Jennings-Roche and Paul Yeager, who are not only series the editors for our special issue, but are also authors of a particularly interesting article. I want to introduce them, have them just share a little bit about themselves with you all, and then get into a big conversation about clarifying intellectual freedom, neutrality, and professional expertise to better defend libraries from book bans, disinformation, and defunding. Paul Yeager, can you say hello to the community for us today?
Hi, I'm Paul Yeager. I'm a professor at the College of Information at the University of Maryland. I'm co-editor of the journal Library Quarterly, and I tend to study things that are law and policy about information, particularly in terms of human rights and civil rights.
Paul, thank you for the work that you've already done as the co-editor for the special issue. And folks, we're going to put a link in the chat for you to get to the issue in general, but also to the preview that Paul and Allison and I did a few weeks ago for the issue. Allison, you want to say hi to everybody?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Allison Jennings-Roche. I am the Associate Director of Digital Initiatives and Collections for the RLB Library at the University of Baltimore. I'm also a PhD candidate in Information Studies at the University of Maryland. I write and I speak and I advocate a lot for libraries around rhetoric, ethics, advocacy for libraries in our, modern era of democratic crisis. So I'm really happy to be here with you today, John.
Same here. Thank you so much. Okay, so in the article, again, folks, the title is Clarifying Intellectual Freedom, Neutrality, and Professional Expertise to Better Defend Libraries from Book Bans, Disinformation, and Defunding. In the article, you said, right now, our self-imposed ideal of neutrality is a gift to those who wish to undermine, defund, and disappear libraries, as it tells librarians they cannot even speak up to defend themselves. Tell me about the impetus behind the article, please.
Yeah, so this has been a topic that Paul and I have been talking about and around for many years, right? And we really felt like this issue of political librarian was the right time, a really urgent time to put all these ideas together to speak about these larger issues. But I do want to be clear and really set the tone in the idea that this idea of neutrality is both a self-imposed problem and it's kind of a fake problem, right? What happens in our daily interactions with our community members, with our customers, with our patrons? People are still seeking access to accurate information. They are still seeking librarians as resources in an age of dis and misinformation. I do want to ground the conversation in the idea that while we're talking about neutrality in the political sphere, the day-to-day work of libraries, despite our calling up to these broader ideas, is still very much rooted in that connection, in that community, and in that understanding of what the librarians have to offer.
The idea of neutrality. You say in the article, the poorly defined nature of some of these ideals around intellectual freedom and neutrality has created continuing problems for the field. I don't disagree. It's the central thesis here. How do you think about the historic ambiguity with those concepts about neutrality around intellectual freedom in particular? And how is that contributing, in your opinion, to the vulnerability that libraries and librarians have? Because it's not just about the institution, it's about the profession, the vulnerability that they have around book bans and disinformation.
These ideals, they were changes that the field made to itself nearly 100 years ago with the Library Bill of Rights in 1939. And in part, they were a reaction to feeling like libraries were being too prescriptive. And in many cases, if you read what library directors and ALA people were saying, they were being very prescriptive about, oh, you want something about this, we'll tell you exactly what to read, whether or not it's what you're asking for. So there was a reasoning behind trying to create these sorts of ideals. But the correction, certainly from a political standpoint, from a policy standpoint, from a talking to your community standpoint, is more than an overcorrection, because it's created a perception of voicelessness or a feeling of you have to be quiet about issues. And so when we think about the recent rise, all at the same time, disinformation, censorship, distrust of government, freer expression of bigotries, massive technological change, these are long ago decisions that have been desperate for reflection and reconsideration, but that need is much more urgent. And if you pull them apart, neutrality has been criticized basically since the beginning of it as an embrace of as an ideal in the field. I mean, for one line of argument is it's literally impossible. No person, no material, no collection, no display, no item, no build, nothing is neutral. But then there's a whole set of substantive critiques of neutrality that have been made. If you try to be neutral, you're supporting those in power. If you try to be neutral, you're tending to be silent about issues. If you're trying to be neutral, you're doing it because it's easier than taking a position. There's a huge history of literature in our field begging the field to reconsider the terminology and the underlying ideals of neutrality. And unfortunately, just like as we've gone along in the field, neutrality has become more powerful over the decades in terms of the field feeling like it can't really defend itself well, or there's all kinds of mythologies about, oh, well, you can't express an opinion if you work for a library, and there's no legal basis for that. And so it has a strange gravity to it. And yet right now it could not be more harmful. The intellectual freedom part, again, is something that has been an issue cycling for nearly 100 years. And that, again, all kinds of opinions on maybe we should be rethinking this. Maybe we should be more articulate about this. Maybe we should use terminology that people understand rather than this term. And, again, we're in a place where we should have dealt with this long ago, but it's now just, and the enormity of the problem is almost beyond belief at this point.
Yeah, and we aren't necessarily arguing just over language, right? But the language kind of belies the ideology and the meaning behind what we're doing here. So instead of calling to these broader, very universal ideas, things like the First Amendment, right? Freedom of speech and expression, within the field, we want to weaken that and turn it into something called intellectual freedom that no one else speaks to or talks about, right? So if we conceptualize our role in the public sphere in this much narrower framework than understanding ourselves as a part of this larger democratic whole, we are weakening our ability to advocate for ourselves and communicate in the public sphere. And additionally, the idea of something like neutrality or staying out of these things is politically useless, but it's also, if we think about ourselves in the context of other public servants, right? Other public serving employees of the United States, police, firefighters, teachers, you name it, they have a position, they have a perspective. They don't expect to not advocate for the needs of their institutions, their communities, or claim expertise, right? Like, of course, I want the firefighter to tell me exactly where to put the smoke detector. People are going to the librarians for specific pieces of information too. We've all trained and committed our lives to this, and we need to be intellectually honest with ourselves about what we're doing and then apply that to this larger political sphere.
The position that those other civil servants have, those other public employees have, vis-a-vis their own paychecks and their own ability to work. I think that's a very important observation. And in a certain respect, we've taken ourselves out of the game as a foundational. I mean, it's a long avoided challenge for us to talk about the foundational ideas of our field. And the long avoided challenge to talk about the foundational challenges of our field. I'm sorry, foundational ideals of our field. It's so funny to me. I'm not a librarian by trade. I've never worked in a library. I don't have an MLS. I didn't go to an high school. Why? What are those pressing foundational challenges that we must start to resolve?
Well, I think, you know, a starting point of that is something, building on what Allison just said, is, you know, the starting point is admitting we have important perspectives and we should be like articulating them, demonstrating them, sharing them. You know, if you went to an architect and you wanted a building built and the response was, well, according to my field, you should design the building however you think fit, and then we'll put it up, whether or not it's a good idea, you probably would be very unhappy. If you went to a doctor and the response was, oh, well, use the internet, and then whatever you think you have, I'll give you a prescription, you'd be unhappy. But in a sense, if you say like, oh, yes, we're neutral about information. Oh, intellectual freedom means everything is equal weight. You're kind of doing the same thing professionally. So when we think foundational change, it really is getting at the, how do we rethink how we think of ourselves? And by not having an active, empowered conception of the field, we can get divorced from really important issues that we should be very engaged in. A great example of this in terms of demonstrating the problem, not great in terms of the outcome, first Trump administration. Every year, the White House budget cut all federal funding for libraries, for museums, for internet access, for literacy, for public media, eliminated things like IMLS. That was in their proposed budget every year of Trump's first term. Yet how much attention was focused by the field at large on the fact that, hey, he's trying to run for president again. These are all the things he said he wanted to do. Here's how they'll affect your life directly. And so that can turn into, you know, that's a real world consequence of having foundational ideas that disempower your own field. And so the foundational issue, these are symptoms, perhaps the most prominent symptoms of a need to reorient the whole field towards demonstrating what it does, clearly saying what it needs in return, and everyone in it, everyone who cares about it, feeling empowered to talk about these things. And if you're not in a position where you're the information professions and you feel empowered to clearly and emphatically refute disinformation movements, censorship movements, then what you're in fact doing is giving them the power to determine what comes next.
Paul, there's a hell of a quote in the article that says, neutrality clings to the library profession like a lamprey with its disc of teeth dug in deeply. I mean, given how embedded it is, and you both said this, in library culture, what are the practical steps that we need to take to begin to dislodge this idea in favor of something more advocacy oriented?
Absolutely. So I think that like the part of it, right, is really understanding how neutrality was founded in this kind of abdication of responsibility. And neutrality fundamentally disconnects you from a community, right? Because you don't take a position, you aren't advocating. And, you know, we can go into larger conversations about some of this is rooted in that disconnect between partisan and politics. Like politics might mean I'm just getting what we need for the library. That doesn't mean that any critique of a policy that impacts your community is necessarily partisanship, right? That's a larger part. But what we've done is we have avoided conflict and responsibility because we just wanted to be seen in a certain way, right? You can go back to the very foundational portions of the culture. But again, that doesn't mean that what we are doing in our day-to-day life is at all neutral, right? Like, I've worked in public libraries, I've worked in special libraries, I've worked in academic libraries. I've never once said, oh, well, here's a piece of disinformation and here's a piece of accurate information. Make up your mind, right? Like, we are consistently, whether it's reader's advisory, finding the local native gardening books, right? It doesn't always need to be this advocacy. It's just naming that, claiming that, and moving that forward into the political sphere at our administrative levels, and understanding how this complacency has gotten us here. I know, Paul, can you jump in on the kind of professional curricula and those kinds of things that we've talked about a lot that have built this culture in our workplaces?
Yeah, if you think about, how we make professionals in our field, it's driven by the accreditation of MLIS programs. And that's driven by, what goes in, that drives what goes into the curriculum and what gets emphasized. And the point has been made many times over the years that we aren't paying attention to things like how to advocate, how to build relationships in local politics and partnerships, in how to articulate impacts of policies, how to engage policy processes. There is that whole world is really not well represented in how the field prepares itself and in professional training curricula. So it's the changing to a more advocacy-oriented posture begins at rethinking how we teach, how, current professionals and future professionals. But it's also how institutions, individual libraries, library systems, how do they talk about what they're doing? Who are they talking to with what they're doing? And, you can see, look at annual reports, or the equivalent made public by various institutions. What are they actually accomplishing? Who are they aiming these documents to? What kind of relationships are they able to build? And it's rethinking how leaders of the professional organizations talk and act. I mean, it's everybody in the field has a role in shifting to being thoughtful about advocacy, being thoughtful about engagement, being thoughtful about the implications of policy, learning to talk about the ramifications of policy. And if we're ever going to change on these things, if the current shocks of now aren't doing it, I don't know what possibly could.
Paul, I was looking up the publication date for re-envisioning the MLS, which was 2015. We're in the first half of 2025 here. As I was looking up that, just for putting my question deck together, the AI that lives inside my machine now asked the next prompt was, why is the MLS not taken seriously? It's very interesting that the algorithm wanted to throw some shade on the degree as I was looking up this issue, and I'm not trying to by asking these questions. I'm not trying to, but there's a very practical set of ways to reimagine, re-envision the future of professional education, and it's an essential survival strategy, as you both said in the article. Do we have? Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, John. Before you move on to the next one, I just want to point out that walking back a little, it was about that same time that there was the infamous, at least within our field, Forbes article that said the least useful graduate degree was the MLIS.
Paul,
And that was
that's
in
a
no small
throwback.
part.
I had forgotten about that, but now you're bringing it
Yeah, but
forward in a way that chills me. Go ahead.
yeah, because in no small part, that what they were arguing there is, or taking advantage of in that argument, was the lack of the field defending itself or articulating for itself.
Mm-hmm.
So it was an opening to go after libraries and librarians as weak because they didn't fight back. And, about the same, that got people's attention in the field a little bit, but again, no big changes happened. Another paper, and this was in Political Librarian, I think 2016, 2017, that was partly in response to that Forbes piece that Lindsay Sarin and I wrote for your journal. Mm-hmm. All librarianship is political, educate accordingly. Mm-hmm. That was about a decade ago, trying to lay out, really before the first Trump administration started doing stuff, mm-hmm. This is all on the horizon. We need to do these things to prepare so bad things don't happen. And yeah, I mean, this is all part of that same legacy of, not being shocked into changing how we want things to be and changing our behavior.
Allison, what are you thinking about?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that we continue claiming these things that ultimately just aren't logical, right? You're like, that's not how we operate. And it's a fundamental misunderstanding of politics, right? Like, it's almost like ooh, that's a dirty word in the field. That happens over and over again. And what I like to remind librarians as we're talking about this and trying to get uncomfortable with the idea of advocacy or getting your hands dirty, and we talk a lot, and the three of us are talking a lot about the field and the profession and the MLIS and the value of our expertise and our degrees. And I totally agree. But if we don't get better at doing this, our communities will suffer. And I think that thread tends to get lost when we talk about this need for neutrality and how much we need to stay out of the political sphere to serve everyone. Well, we're not going to be serving anyone if we're unable to really grapple with these issues and advocate for our libraries for the sake of serving our communities.
I mean, if neutrality and that studied remove is a professional liability, then you're absolutely right, Allison. How do we shift the culture of our institutions? How do we address the needs of our communities? But there's a lot of path dependency in our sector around this idea of neutrality, even though it is, as your thesis is in the article, of professional liability. How do we do it without alienating folks who might not be as theoretically and critically engaged as you are? I mean, there's boards, there's funders, there's longtime collegial relationships. I mean, I'm always sensitive to that. The idea that we might have to reimagine or re-envision, that's a painful process for everybody involved.
I think a lot of that is reasserting that we are public and civil servants, right? And we're here to serve our communities, and we have specific sets of expertise. And while we are currently in a moment, right, like, things are terrifying. If there was ever a need for communal resources for information in the rise of AI, mis and disinformation, I think that also provides an opening, right, in reasserting the expertise and the training of librarians as being, lighthouses in this broader storm of information. We aren't necessarily claiming a partisan side. That would be completely inappropriate as civil servants, but we are providing accurate, well-researched information or sources of information, or helping people navigate these systems that are increasingly opaque, hard to navigate, and are necessary for the function of, business, of communities, of organizations. And there really isn't any other option. So I think while we could say neutrality is upheld for specific non-partisan kind of reasons, and I think largely that's kind of what we mean when we mean neutral, and I have no objection with that piece of it. But claiming the librarian expertise is more urgent than ever when people are getting pulled into, machines that make up information, convince them of falsehoods, of you Google something very simple, you can't find an answer. And I actually think that that's almost the answer to the boards and to the larger organizations in asserting, hey, we are all dealing with this issue. You know who can help? The librarians. They do have this expertise and they can help evaluate the information.
Paul, there's an ontological issue here. Intellectual freedom, free expression, First Amendment, the limited public forum, all those different things that contribute, to a conversation around neutrality. And yet we're in a very politically divided and hostile environment politically, Paul. How do we do this inside the community and outside the community, in your opinion, with as much alacrity as we can?
Well, one thing I think is if we had more faith in ourselves, and that is not to sound all aspirational and wispy. There's grounding in that. One of the most surprising things I've ever been involved in as a researcher, during the lockdown phase of the pandemic, Karen Ketnick and I decided, hey, there have been sporadic articles in our literature talking about the media portrayals of librarians, but usually in appearance and affect and, not really what are the library characters conveying. And, this was as disinformation about vaccines was ramping up. So it seemed very poignant. And so we contrasted movie, TV portrayals of librarians through history, pegging them to the political issues of the time. And what we found was the more active librarians are in asserting their roles, the better they're portrayed in media. And in the 1950s, when librarians, not everybody, but certainly librarians louder than any other segment of the country, were standing up to the censorship of the Red Scare and McCarthy era, was peak portrayal of librarians as heroes. And you can find through that, through time, the more librarians are open and clear that they are fighting for things that matter to their communities, like freedom of speech, the better they are seen and the more valued they are. And so that is McCarthy is a long time ago, but at the same time, it's awfully similar to where we are now. And, we have enormous expertise with information in a space where it is more confusing than it's ever been. And more state actors, more non-state actors, more corporations have so much incentive to be pushing the disinformation. So we have a set of skills that's never been more needed. And we need to talk about that in those terms. We need to believe in ourselves in that. And, there's historical precedence of if we do that, it will productively shift how we're being viewed. And that starts with being, it keeps coming back to this, being clear in the language, being directly engaged with our communities and what they need, not being afraid to advocate and engage.
In the article, and Allison, I'm going to direct this one to you. In the article, you say, by refusing to articulate that being a librarian means knowing which sources are more accurate and more reliable only empowers those who peddle, as Paul is saying, disinformation. There's been a lot of conversations over the years about professional awe, and there's a lot of conversations about professional expertise. And to Paul's research, it's interesting because what I was expecting you to say, Paul, let me go to him for one more second. What I was expecting you to say about the image of librarians in the media was that things haven't changed over the years, but that valiance between a hero narrative and a perhaps an object on a TV show, that's really interesting to me. That
Yeah,
being, yeah, go ahead, Alice. I'm sorry.
no, I was just going to say, I think there's absolutely something there, right? That self-objectification that kind of exists within the field that feeds this larger vocational all narrative. I think that's part of what has fed this current moment. I don't think so much externally, honestly. Like, I don't know that the rest of the public is paying that much attention to the like kind of internal inside baseball, vocational all that we're stuff that we're doing. But I do think what has happened is that we have this movement towards, as happens in a lot of pink collar coded fields, we are here to serve. We have this like, I am doing the most important job in the world, right? Which happens a lot, social workers, teachers, librarians, a lot of us think that, have that self-conceptualization. But the distinction between us and those perhaps with more blue collar fields is that we aren't then using that to advocate for the needs to continue doing that work. You would never see, perhaps, again, a firefighter to not advocate for the most necessary safety equipment or training or anything that they need to do to stay up to date. And what happens is, because we have these external pressures to be politically neutral, we have this internal self-objectification, is that we end up kind of in this morass where there's no way out of that circle intellectually, and we're trying to find one now. And I do think there absolutely is a balance between saying, hey, we're standing in the gap between misinformation and the rest of citizenry, and like, librarians are people and they deserve professional boundaries and they need to be paid appropriately. That's almost getting lost right now because we're talking about defunding and criminalization and all of those things, but it's all a larger whole. And if we find a way to thread that needle, right, to assert this expertise, to talk about how urgent and necessary it is in an age of malinformation, while also reaffirming the fact that librarians are people too. The vast majority of librarians across the country do not necessarily have extreme political positions, right? They seek to serve, they seek to engage in their communities. I'm not going to say that librarians aren't people and there aren't some people that do have extreme political positions, but I certainly wouldn't say that's the norm. It's certainly not the norm in the data. What we see is that people who are librarians are just people. They're members of their community. They're deeply rooted and they want to help those people. That's why they went into this field. So how do we reassert that knowledge, that expertise, the value of the degree, of our training programs, of how we got here, while still also finding a way to make this profession sustainable? Because we are seeing people burn out, we are seeing people leave, and we saw that even before our current era of extreme crisis. So all of these things are interconnected, and perhaps untangling that ball of wax will give us a better path forward.
Well, let me ask you the most dangerous of all questions here for our final question, and I'll let whoever wants to take it first can take it first. Do we need a new foundational statement for librarianship? We've had Paul, you mentioned at the beginning, it's been 70 years since the Library Bill of Rights. Do we need to either re-engage, reimagine, or reboot something that is as foundational as that code of ethics that expresses the value system, is intended to support why we do the work as a mission? Are we at that point with the current moment?
I think I'll go first because I'd love for Paul to have the last word on this one.
Sure.
But I think maybe, but I also, part of that, a little bit of pushback would be like, how much is that of that code of ethics and those value statements driving this? And how much is kind of professional inertia? And I heard from my supervisor and I'm getting it here, right? Because I think in any organization, I studied organizational theory, is there's a lot of overemphasis on these guiding documents and strategic plans. And people in leadership think they're really important. But I don't actually know that those guiding documents are the things that drive culture. And culture is honestly, ultimately, what I think has gotten us into this place, right? Because you could have, plot leaders saying neutrality is super important. But if we saw librarians on the ground really advocating for their communities and saying, hey, we're still neutral, we're nonpartisan in whatever way you want to take that language, we wouldn't necessarily be here, right? So I think it is a yes and I think we really need to seriously think about those things, but also acknowledge that the larger culture is so much more complex and interdependent and based on relationships and the way we have conditioned and trained people to operate than these kind of guiding documents might lead us to believe.
Thank you for that answer. Paul, what are your parting thoughts today?
It's the Bill of Rights is a piece of a large ecosystem. And as Allison has been saying, it's, there's all of the unwritten parts of the ecosystem. There's also a whole bunch of other written parts of the ecosystem. And so, if you look at say the ALA policy manual, it's full of things that are wildly out of date because they were passed and are part of the section of positions taken by the field, or they're things that are really not terribly brave stances. Like there's somewhere in Part B of that, there was a vote, I guess, in the 80s that the field is opposed to nuclear war. I mean, that's good, but so, thinking about if we're going to re-evaluate, it really is gonna need to be holistic. And the Bill of Rights is a great starting point for these discussions because it has been so influential and it is so succinct, even though a lot of the gravity that it has are ideas that aren't necessarily explicitly in it, but that have come from it. But it really is just a beginning point where it should be a conversation of many years, and it should involve all of the parts of the ecosystem, because it really requires all of us to rethink a whole lot of what we're doing. And the lack of progress on these issues, I mean, just to pull it back to the media portrayals example, in the 1950s, particularly mid-50s, prestige films starring Oscar winners portraying hero librarians were a thing. And one of them was a movie called Storm Center, starring Bette Davis. And she's the director of a public library who's trying to stand up to censorship from the Red Scare. She's dealing with gendered issues in the profession and how it's negatively impacting how the librarians are viewed as experts. And it is 70 years old. I mean, that's just, the tech would be different, the cars would be different, but otherwise you could make the movie now and more or less leave it as it is. And, that was portraying the director of the library as a bulwark of freedom of speech, as somebody trying to advance civil rights. And the issues in terms of what's impacting the field are fairly stagnant from then till now, at least it's portrayed there. And so when we are saying this is a conversation we have to have, it's been a conversation we needed to have for a very, very long time. And the longer we've put it off, the more complicated it's become, the more inertia there is to battle, the more inputs have come into the system that need to be shifted or rethought. So putting it off has been a terrible strategy. And however we want to start, whichever parts of the system are the ones that start it, it desperately needs to happen.
Paul, thank you for wrapping that up so succinctly. I had two things come to mind. One is that we should probably do a screening or a watch party for that movie. It's been a long time, you know. It isn't one of the ones that's on the tip of the tongue usually when people talk about librarians and movies. And the other is that it's more akin, the librarianship with the Bill of Rights and everything is actually more akin to the English Constitution that's unwritten than it is necessarily to the 1878 kind of approach to things in the United States. That's really fascinating. Paul, Allison, it's been a real pleasure to talk to you today about your article from the Political Librarian, the special issue this year, the 2025 special issue, clarifying intellectual freedom, neutrality, and professional expertise to better defend libraries from book bans, disinformation, and defunding. You're very generous with your time. You're very bold with your thinking, and you're also very brave for coming out and having a conversation out in public like this. We've discussed a few things that are either third rails but you've also, I think, made some shibboleths happen for folks who want to meet you in this conversation. So thanks for doing that today.
Thank you for having us, John.
Absolutely. If you want to be a part, folks, of the Political Librarian, thepoliticallibrarian.org, notice, if you will, that it's not the political library, it's about the profession. Thepoliticallibrarian.org, we are always looking for new writers, whether it's a white paper, a thought piece, even anonymous contributions to help move these conversations forward in the profession. So looking forward to seeing you all online as the next series of conversations goes with the Political Librarian special issue webinars over lunchtime. Thanks for being a part of it all, team. Have a good day.